Welcome to Sleepy Chronicles. Whatever today brought you the noise, the rush, the things that didn't go the way you wanted, you can set all of that down now. Lie back, put your headphones in, let your shoulders drop and your jaw unclench. This is your time, and there is nowhere else you need to be. If you enjoy what we do here, quiet voices, slow history, and the kind of stories that make your eyelids feel heavier with each sentence, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It costs nothing and means quite a lot. And let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. We read every single one. Tonight, we're going to a medieval castle where survival depended on rules nobody ever wrote down for you. Some were as small as where you stood at dinner. Others, broken without knowing it, could cost you your life. So get comfortable. We'll take it from here. A castle never explained its rules. It simply showed a guest what happened when he broke one. The torches along the great hall threw shadows that moved a half second before a person did. So for one held breath, the shape on the wall seemed to already know which way he was about to step. The flagstones underfoot stayed colder than anyone expected, even near a roaring fire, because the building was built to outlast a stranger, not comfort him. Somewhere above, a footstep crossed a floor no one could see, and a careful guest learned to listen for it. Every space here had an owner, and every doorway carried a permission attached to it like a second lock. So the line between a welcomed guest and a trespasser was sometimes a single step. The most dangerous object on a medieval dinner table was not the knife. It was the salt. A solid silver salt cellar sat near the lord at the high table, and its position decided a person's worth before a single word was spoken. The honored guests sat close to it, on the raised dais, inside the warmth of the Lord's notice. Everyone seated further down the long table, past where the salt could reach, already knew their place, which is exactly where the phrase, "below the salt," came from. A rank measured in inches of polished wood. A young page learns this before almost anything else. He carries dishes toward the dais with his eyes fixed slightly downward, careful never to let his shadow cross the Lord's plate. One evening, distracted by a dog barking in the yard, he steps a half pace too far across the rushes scattered over the floor, the woven reeds marking, almost invisibly, where the lower hall ended and the Lord's space began. The hall does not erupt. Nobody shouts. A single steward simply turns his head, slow and unhurried, and the boy feels his whole body go cold before he finishes correcting his stance. The salt never moved an inch. It was the boy who learned, in the space of one turned head, exactly how far he was allowed to stand. Even the staircases were built to wound a stranger, and the design made sure of it. Most spiral stairs inside a castle tower turn clockwise on the way up, chosen with violence already in mind. A defender retreating upward, sword in his right hand, could swing freely around the central column. An attacker climbing after him found that same column blocking his own sword arm at every turn. The stone always won, a chambermaid carrying water up to the Cellar, the private upper room where the lord and lady spoke without an audience, learns a different rule on those same stairs. She does not simply walk up and knock. She climbs slowly, the jug heavy against her hip, and stops 2 steps below the door to listen. She counts breaths in the silence, 3, sometimes 5. A voice cut off mid-sentence is a mistake remembered far longer than the water she carries. Climb those same stairs yourself, sword in hand, and feel it. Your arm scrapes uselessly against the column with every turn, while the man waiting above already knows exactly how many steps it will take you to reach him. She set the jug down only after the silence on the other side of the door told her it was safe too. Down at the base of every tower, worn smoother than the stone around it, lies the threshold, the place where feet have crossed for centuries, in directions both welcomed and forbidden. No one polishes it on purpose. It simply wears down, one hesitation at a time, the stone remembering what the people who stood on it would rather forget. Inside a castle, silence was never simply the absence of sound. It was a held breath, a private calculation, a tongue trained to know exactly how much it was allowed to say. Even laughter answered to this same arithmetic, safe and welcome from the right mouth, watched closely from the wrong one. A hall could be loud with footsteps and dogs, and the clatter of dishes, and every voice in it was still being measured by someone listening from a shadowed doorway. A word did not need to be shouted to be dangerous. It only needed to be heard by the wrong person, in the wrong corner, at the wrong hour, and repeated to someone who mattered. In a medieval castle, the most dangerous sound a servant could make was not a lie. It was speaking out of turn. A servant did not address the Lord directly unless given leave to, and that leave was never assumed twice. Word traveled up through the ranks, the the way water traveled uphill, which is to say, it didn't, not without help. A kitchen boy with news for the Lord told the steward. The steward told the chamberlain. And only then, if the matter warranted it, did a voice finally reach the high table, smoothed and shortened along the way. Each mouth shaped it a little differently along the climb, softening whatever sounded too urgent, too blunt, or too close to an accusation. A young messenger learns the shape of this the hard way. Sent running from the stables with word that a horse has gone lame before the hunt, he reaches the hall out of breath, straw still clinging to his sleeves, the words already forming in his mouth, and stops himself at the threshold because no one has yet looked up to acknowledge him. He waits. He shifts his weight from one foot to the other, the urgency of his message burning in his chest, until the chamberlain finally turns and gives the smallest nod. Only then does he speak, and even then he opens with the formula every servant learns before almost any other words. By your leave. His sentence stays short after that, his eyes low, his voice pitched just above a whisper. What arrived at the high table was no longer his message. It was a version of it that the castle had already decided was safe to hear. Stone walls were meant to keep secrets in. In a medieval castle, they just as often let them out. Corridors built from solid rock seemed like the safest place in the world to speak freely. And that illusion was exactly the danger. Sound traveled oddly through thick stone, bouncing down stairwells, and through narrow slits meant for arrows, carrying a complaint twice as far as the speaker ever intended. Speaking against the Lord was never simply rude, either. In an age when even imagining harm to a ruler could be treated as treason, a careless sentence muttered in an empty hallway carried the same weight as one shouted in open rebellion. Servants who repeated such words to the right ears were not punished for listening. They were occasionally rewarded for it, which meant every servant doubled as a quiet kind of watcher, whether they wanted to or not. An older manservant, decades into service, knows this better than anyone and still forgets it once. Tired, his back aching from a day spent hauling firewood, the smell of wood smoke still thick in his clothes, he mutters to another servant that the Lord works his people harder than he works his hounds. He says it low, almost under his breath, certain the corridor is empty. It is not. At the top of the stairwell above, a young groom stands frozen, with a saddle blanket over both arms, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on the middle distance. The kind of stillness that only comes from trying very hard not to be heard breathing. Speak too freely in an empty corridor, and you will hear it too late. The half-second of silence after the words leave your mouth, right before you remember exactly how far stone can carry a voice you thought was private. By morning, the manservant's place at the hearth was simply empty, and no one in the kitchen asked why. That was how it ended for some of them. Not with a confrontation, not with a raised voice, but with an absence so clean and so complete that the hall absorbed it like water into old stone and moved on without a word. A medieval great hall at dinner looked, from the doorway, like a celebration. Candles burning, platters steaming, 100 people packed along trestle tables from one end to the other. The smell of roasted meat and woodsmoke and tallow reached the entrance before anything else did, warm and heavy, the kind of smell that made the stomach decide things before the mind had a chance to weigh in. But every person who walked into that hall carried a different version of the same question, unspoken and urgent. Where do I sit? What am I allowed to touch? And how long before someone notices I have made a mistake? The hall did not share a meal. It performed one, and the performance had rules that nobody posted on the wall, because everyone who belonged there already knew them. A medieval lord did not simply eat first because he was hungry. He ate first because eating before him was the same as standing above him. And no one in that hall had made that mistake twice. No dish was placed before a guest until it had been set before the Lord at the high table, tasted by his appointed taster, and accepted. The taster ate a small portion of everything, not out of loyalty alone, but because poison in a medieval hall was a genuine enough threat that the precaution was simply standard practice. He chewed slowly, unhurried, his face giving nothing away, while everyone below sat with hands in their laps, cups untouched. A taster who lived long in the role developed a particular kind of stillness, a practiced calm that he wore like a second skin, while he waited quietly to see what his own body would tell him next. A visiting lord from the eastern counties arrives at the high table and lowers himself into his chair with the unhurried ease of a man who has chaired many such suppers, his traveling coat still dusty at the hem, one thick ring catching the candlelight as he reaches for his wine the moment it is poured. He does not drain it. He simply lifts it, a small gesture reflexive, the way a man reaches for his own cup at his own table. Nobody speaks. The Lord at the high table does not look up, but the cup is noticed, and the man holding it, though he does not yet know it, has already answered the room's first question about exactly what kind of guest he is. The taster's slow nod, when it finally came, released the hall like a breath that had been held too long. The most coveted food in a medieval castle had no flavor worth mentioning. It was white bread, and its meaning had nothing to do with taste. Coarse dark bread made from rye or barley was what most people in the castle ate, filling and reliable and never remarked upon. White bread required refined wheat, milling skill, and a baker's deliberate labor. And so it arrived at the high table alone, cut into flat trenchers that served as edible plates by the meal's end. The distinction was total and visible from across the room. Dark bread below, white bread above. A division so consistent and so legible that a newcomer could map the entire hierarchy of the hall just by watching where the loaves went. A baker's apprentice, broad across the shoulders, flour still pale in the creases of his knuckles, is sent to replace a depleted loaf at the high table. He carries it the full length of the hall, the bread warm against his palms, and he is almost to the dais step when he stumbles on a loose rush, catches himself against the edge of a bench, and steadies the loaf with both hands pressed firmly around it. He delivers it correctly, backs away with his eyes down, and says nothing. But a loaf that arrives at the Lord's table bearing the full impression of a working man's hands is not placed before the Lord. It is lifted away without comment by the usher, set aside, and the apprentice watches from the far end of the hall as a fresh one is sent for. Eat the wrong bread in that hall, and the room would remember it long after the meal was forgotten. Not with anger, but with a kind of quiet, absolute certainty about exactly who you were. He is not punished. He simply does not carry bread to the dais again. The candles at the high table burned longest, replaced before they could gutter, while the ones further down the hall were left to find their own end, which was, in its way, as clear a statement as anything else in that room about who the dark was allowed to reach first. A person entering a medieval castle carried their rank in their body before they opened their mouth. The angle of a shoulder, the depth of a bow, the precise point on the floor where a pair of eyes came to rest. All of it was being read continuously by everyone in the room who knew how. A body that moved correctly was invisible in the best possible way, absorbed into the rhythm of the hall without comment. A body that moved wrong announced itself, and in a place where announcement was always the first step toward consequence, the safest thing a person could do was learn to disappear. In a medieval great hall, the most dangerous thing a man could do was look the Lord in the eye. Not because looking was forbidden, because looking incorrectly was. The bow was not a single gesture. It was a precise calculation, with the depth calibrated to the rank of the person being addressed, the duration matched to the formality of the occasion, and the angle of the neck held long enough to signal submission without being held so long as to suggest it was theatrical. Getting it wrong in either direction carried a cost. Too shallow, and the room read it as arrogance. Too deep, held too long, and it read as mockery, an exaggerated performance of deference that was, in its own way, a kind of insult. The goal was a gesture so perfectly appropriate that nobody noticed it at all. A young squire, newly arrived in the household, his boots still stiff and unbroken, bows at the correct depth when the Lord enters the hall. He has practiced this, but he raises his eyes a half second too soon, before the bow is fully complete, and his gaze meets the Lord's for just a moment, not a long look, nothing defiant, simply the involuntary reflex of a young man whose body finished the gesture before his training could stop it. The Lord says nothing. The squire finishes his bow, straightens, and finds a point somewhere past the Lord's left shoulder to fix his eyes on for the remainder of the morning. His riding instructor, watching from the far side of the hall, makes a small note of it. The squire will hear about it later, in a corridor after dark, with no one else present to witness the correction. In medieval England, wearing the wrong color was not a fashion mistake. It was against the law. Beginning in the mid-14th century, a series of laws known as sumptuary laws dictated with precise specificity what a person could wear, and the specificity was deliberate. Purple was reserved for royalty. Scarlet and deep crimson required a minimum rank. The type of fur lining a collar, sable, ermine, or rabbit mapped directly onto a person's social standing, and wearing fur above one's station was not merely presumptuous, it was prosecutable. the laws existed because clothing had become the most immediate and visible way to read a person's place in the world, which meant a person wearing above their station was not simply dressing ambitiously. They were lying in fabric in public to everyone who looked at them. A prosperous wool merchant, newly wealthy enough to afford the kind of cloth he spent his life trading, has a coat made in a deep murrey, a dark purplish red, that sits at the very edge of what his rank permits, close enough to crimson that in certain light, in certain rooms, the distinction blurs. He has examined it carefully in daylight before the evening, turning it near the window, convincing himself the color stays within bounds. He wears it to a castle dinner because it is his finest coat. Walk the length of that hall in it, and feel the moment a steward's eyes find the coat before they find the man wearing it. He is received. He is seated. He is not accused of anything that evening, but the coat is remembered, and his next invitation takes considerably longer to arrive. The hall held 100 people that night, every one of them reading every other one quietly, continuously, and with a thoroughness that left very little unexamined by the time the last dish was cleared. The body was never simply a body in that room. It was an argument made in posture and fabric and the precise angle of a chin, and the room was always listening for the places where the argument did not quite hold. There was no trial. There was no announcement. There was simply a morning when something had changed, and everyone in the castle understood what that change meant without needing to be told. The manservant's place at the hearth was empty. The squire had been reassigned. The invitation had stopped coming. In a medieval castle, justice was not a system with procedures and witnesses and written verdicts. It was a decision made in a private room, delivered to the rest of the world as a fact that had already happened. Understanding how that decision worked, and how close a person might be to becoming the subject of one, was, in the end, the most important thing the castle ever taught. A medieval lord did not need a court. He was the court, and the verdict was whatever he said it was when the door was closed. The hall of justice in a medieval castle was not always a grand chamber. It was often simply where the lord happened to be, his Cellar, a recess off the great hall, a corner near the fire before supper. There were no robes, no formal proceedings, no record made for later examination. A complaint was heard, or it wasn't. The accused might speak, or might be spoken about in their absence. Their character assembled from the accounts of people they had never seen entering the room. A minor landholder, summoned to answer a dispute over a field boundary, arrives at the castle and is shown not to the great hall, but to a small antechamber off the corridor near the kitchens. He waits on a bench with his cap in his hands, back straight, aware that how he sits is being noted the same as everything else. When the Lord's steward finally comes, it is not to bring him before the Lord. It is to tell him that the matter has been considered and that the field belongs to the Lord's tenant. The landholder opens his mouth. He closes it again. He stands, replaces his cap, and thanks the steward for his time. He does not ask by what reasoning the decision was reached, because asking would itself become a new matter to be considered, and he has already learned from the long wait on that bench exactly how much weight his presence carries in this building. The verdict was delivered to him in a corridor by someone who had not been present for it, and he walked home in the same afternoon light he had arrived in, the field already gone. Every castle had a threshold. Every castle had worn one down. At the base of each tower, at the entry to each corridor, at the door of every room that mattered, the stone beneath a visitor's feet was always a little smoother than the stone around it, polished not by any hand, but by centuries of crossings, each one a small decision rendered in a body's worth of momentum. This was the threshold, and it was the most honest record a castle kept, not the documents in the Lord's chest, not the tallies scratched into the kitchen wall, but this, the worn place where feet had been allowed to pass, again and again, until the rock itself gave way a little in acknowledgement. The threshold did not record names. It recorded permission. A doorway most people could not cross wore down only at the center, a single narrow strip where the few who could pass had done so carefully, one at a time. In some castles, the threshold stone was the actual site of judgment. A man standing inside it was considered to be under the Lord's protection, while a man standing outside it, even by half a step, was not. The line between safety and exposure was sometimes literally underfoot, drawn not in ink, but in the wearing of old stone. The rules of a medieval castle were to stand, what to say when to speak, how to bow, what to wear, how to carry a loaf of bread without leaving the marks of your hands in it, were all variations on a single question, asked by the castle of every person who entered it. The same question the threshold had been asking for centuries, worn smooth by everyone who had ever approached it, and paused for just a moment to calculate their answer. It was always the same question. Only the answer changed, and the answer was in the crossing. A castle that had stood for 200 years had seen 10,000 such crossings, and remembered all of them the same way, as an absence or a presence, a wearing down or a closing off, a door that opened or a door that simply, quietly, did not. Rest now. The stone has been here longer than any of us, and it will be here long after the last torch goes out and the last name is forgotten. The hall is quiet tonight. The fire burned low. The rushes still. Somewhere in the walls, a draft moves through a passage no one uses anymore, carrying with it the particular cold of old stone in the small hours, and then settling again, and then nothing. Let the walls hold whatever they are holding. Let the threshold be what it is, a place someone else has already decided for you, a long time ago, in a room you will never have to enter. You are on the right side of it. You have always been on the right side of it. Rest. If these stories have found their way into your evenings, if a slow voice and the weight of old stone have made it a little easier to let the day go, we would be glad to keep bringing them to you. Liking this video and subscribing costs nothing and means everything to a small channel still finding its way. Wherever in the world you are listening from tonight, we are glad you are here. Let everything else go. The castle is asleep. You can be too.